Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 64th ever Highlight Haven interview. My name is Matthew Heiserman, and today we are joined by Football Guys journalist Dave Kluge. Dave, it's great to have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. We were talking a little bit pre-show, but I have seen you coming across my feed lately, interviewing some really great guests, and I am honored that you asked me to come on the show, Matthew.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And right off the bat, I just want to start by asking when you first knew that you wanted to work in the sports industry.
That's a good question. It was kind of a pipe dream my entire life, and I never really thought it's something that would be an actual opportunity.
Mhm.
So I was publishing articles, like full-length articles to Reddit, and this was back in 2016. I started doing that, but I had always kind of been in different online communities, talking with other sports fans, and somebody from Fantasy Pros reached out to me and they said, "Hey, you're a pretty good writer. Would you be interested in writing at Fantasy Pros?" And of course, I immediately got these expectations that I was going to be one of their lead analysts and on podcasts and doing all this stuff.
Mhm.
That's not the reality of the industry. I started doing game recaps for the Sacramento Kings and then, took out a few other teams. And then I started doing some MLB coverage. And then it was when I started doing NFL, which is really my major love. Once I started doing some of the NFL news and game recaps, then it kind of sparked something in me where I said, I want to do more than just a side hustle here because that's what it was for me. I was working a normal full time job, and then after work, I would just plug in and do whatever I could for Fantasy Pros. Started sharing some of my articles on Twitter. Started a startup with some friends during 2020 when COVID hit, and a lot of people had some kind of extra free time, and it just spiraled from there. So it's something that I've always wanted to do, but it wasn't until about 2019, 2020 that I really started putting a concentrated effort into trying to make it, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I love to hear that. And getting into the NFL draft that obviously just took place yesterday in round four of the draft, the Los Angeles Rams selected running back Jarquez Hunter out of Auburn. This is the final year of Kyron Williams' contract, and now both Hunter and Blake Corum are on the team. Do you think there's a chance that this means the Rams won't re sign Williams after the season? Or do you think it's more of a they weren't too satisfied with Blake Corum, maybe they're trying to find his replacement at RB2?
I think it's probably a little bit of both.
Mhm.
Sean McVay, he inherited Todd Gurley from the Jeff Fisher era. He wasn't the one that went out there and made this big splashy investment. If you look at how Sean McVay has attacked the running back position since he's been the head coach, it is very much so just been throwing picks late in the draft and hoping that they could find somebody. And we haven't really seen any of these guys do much as rookies. Even Kyron Williams, he was dealing with the foot injury, but did almost nothing as a rookie. And then a lot of people just kind of wrote him off as something that wasn't going to happen. Huge breakout in year two. I see a lot of people now doing the same thing with Blake Corum, saying that Blake Corum isn't going to do much because he didn't as a rookie, but I'm not ready to write him off yet because this is
Yeah.
what Sean McVay likes to do. So when I see them bringing a guy like Jarquez Hunter, or I'm sorry, not Jarquez, yeah,
Mhm.
Jarquez Hunter, when I see them bring him in, I mean, he fits a similar mold to Kyron Williams and Blake Corum, this big bodied, punishing running back. So I don't know if they drafted Hunter saying this is going to be the Kyron Williams replacement, but it is big enough draft capital that I think that they're hoping that if they struck gold here, then they don't have to offer that long-term contract to Kyron because there's two different types of coaches in the NFL, and Sean McVay fits into that younger archetype, the guys who know that running backs don't really matter and they're looking to save money at that position. So I think he'll just continue to keep finding these cheap, usable young running backs.
Yeah, and looking at the first round, the Buccaneers selected Ohio State wide receiver Emeka Egbuka, and no matter what the Buccaneers wide receiver core looks like, it feels like Mike Evans is going to get his targets no matter what. He's obviously had over 1,000 receiving yards every single season of his career. He's an older veteran at this point. However, do you think this could sort of mess with the targets between both Chris Godwin and Jalen McMillan? Are those players that you would avoid in fantasy? Could they potentially slip now that Egbuka is also in that core?
I think that's a really good question, and I think the immediate reaction I saw from so many people was that this was a terrible landing spot for Emeka Egbuka,
Yeah.
and in the short term, it could be. If you look last year, Roma Dunze landed into a similar situation where he had two very good veterans in front of him, and well, there were some flashes here and there. The overall production wasn't great for Dunze. You can go back 2 years, Jackson Smith-Njigba getting drafted to a team with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf
Yeah.
had the same kind of uphill battle to find relevancy, and I think that's where Egbuka is right now. I don't think there's any world where he's going to be able to come in and usurp the role from Chris Godwin or from Mike Evans. But I think the upside here is that last year this team ran a ton of 11 personnel, and that was with Chris Godwin missing the majority of the year. That was with Mike Evans dealing with injuries of his own. Jalen McMillan was a third round rookie that didn't do much in the first half of the season, and they still continued to put three wide receivers out there as much as they could. So I think Igbuka is going to be close to a full time player. Last year, they were just above 70% 11 personnel rate without any good wide receivers for a lot of the season. Now they have three very good wide receivers. I'd expect that to tick up to probably 80,
Mhm.
85%. So Buka is going to get his opportunity. But I think what they're doing is trying to set up for life after Mike Evans and Chris
Yeah.
Godwin. Mike Evans, going into his age 32 season. Chris Godwin, 29 years old, coming off an injury. And they've got some good pieces there with Jalen McMillan, who broke out late in the year. And Emeka Egbuka, when I watch him, I see a lot of the same things that I saw from early career Chris Godwin, a guy who is
Yeah.
a willing and capable blocker, who likes to play out of the slot, who can make big plays after the catch, is aggressive at the catch point. And we've seen as Godwin has grown his role throughout the NFL. Now he's a guy who can beat press coverage on the outside, something he couldn't do early in his career. So once Evans gets to the point that his career is looking over, I see it pretty easy for them to just make Igbuka that full-time slot player. They could move Chris Godwin into the X role, and then Jalen McMillan can do what he does best as a flanker.
Now we talked about Jarquez Hunter and another interesting rookie running back. Maybe your favorite player in the entire class is RJ Harvey from UCF, who was drafted to the Denver Broncos. What do you expect the distribution to look like between Harvey, Audric Estime, and Jaleel McLaughlin in that Broncos backfield? And how long will it take before Harvey becomes the clear-cut RB1 for Denver?
You're asking great questions here, Matthew. I can tell that you really put in your research before the show, and I appreciate that. It is a good question, and I love RJ Harvey. He was a guy that I liked as soon as I started watching him play. Reminded me of Tariq Cohen, a small guy that can just bounce
Mhm.
all over the field, has the big
Yeah,
play upside, has some receiving chops as well. And when you look at the history of Sean Payton and how he's deployed his backs, it's no secret that he likes to have this kind of thunder and lightning approach. The thunder guys, if you will, would be what we saw from Deuce McAllister and Mark Ingram and last year with
yeah.
Javonte Williams. And then he has these lightning guys, Reggie Bush, Alvin Kamara,
Mhm.
Darren Sproles, Jaleel McLaughlin. I think when you look at what RJ Harvey does best, he fits in as that lightning guy. He's not going to be getting a lot of early down work, probably won't be getting the goal line work early either. But with a guy like Audric Estime, he can do all of these things. So I'd expect Audric Estime to take a lot of the early down and goal line work. RJ Harvey can come in on third down. He can come in hurry up offenses. He's an older prospect, already 24 years old. So he's got the experience. One of his biggest strengths is in pass protection as well. So he's not one of these young guys that can catch the ball that needs to get up to speed on NFL pass protection. They could immediately put him in that role. So I'd expect touches to be split kind of 50-50. But because RJ Harvey has one, the big play upside, and two,
Mhm.
the receiving chops, I think for fantasy football, it makes RJ Harvey the much more valuable player.
Yeah. Mhm. Absolutely, and we were talking about Egbuka and how he's going into a really good wide receiver core right now. Another one to look at is the Bears, who with their first 2 picks selected Luther Burden and Colston Loveland. This is a team, the Bears, that already has Roma Dunze and DJ Moore. Roma Dunze kind of entered the same situation last year with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. Allen obviously didn't end up being that impactful, but it was still the same sort of situation right after the draft. From a fantasy perspective, would you be worried about either Burden or Loveland's target share considering who they're playing behind?
Yeah, I mean, you look at what Ben Johnson's doing here, and I
Mhm.
thought I had a clear picture after round one, where I said, they're going to want to switch to a base 12 personnel where they can have Colston Loveland and Cole Kmet being
Mhm.
these two mismatch guys that can block and run routes. Whatever the defense puts out on the field, they'll be able to counter with their personnel. And
Yeah.
it looked really obvious like that's what they were hoping to do. I'm a Bears fan, so I get pretty plugged into the Bears beat here, and I fear what happened is that they had their eyes on Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson because that was a huge need for them at running back. And I think when both of those players went off the board directly before them, I think they might have panicked a little bit. Now, I don't think they panicked and made a bad decision. When you don't get
Yeah.
the guy that you want to get, you go best player available. And I think Luther Burden was the best player available. But now they're in this situation where on every single offensive snap, you're going to have either Burden, Komet, or Loveland watching from the sidelines. So they have more weapons and then they can deploy on any given play right now. I almost wonder if DJ Moore is going to be a trade candidate now because you look at what Luther Burden does. He and DJ Moore have a lot of overlapping skill sets. And if you dig deep into the tape from last year, I don't like to throw the term effort around because there could be more to it, but there were a lot of plays where you saw DJ Moore giving up if he wasn't the primary target, or you see him walking off the field before the whistle blew. And that's something that Ben Johnson recently talked about in a press conference, that he wants his receivers blocking and he wants them giving full effort, even if they aren't the primary target. That to me sounded like a pretty heavy handed message to DJ Moore. Whether they trade him or whether they try to see how things shake out in camp, still yet to see, but definitely tempering expectations for Loveland and Burden in year one.
And maybe they also want to make that receiver core a little younger if they get rid of Moore. And that's not to say that Moore is old. Obviously, he's just 28 years old.
Mhm.
But when you're talking about a core with all 1 year or first year, second year guys, and then obviously Caleb Williams at quarterback, maybe they just want to really go into that youth and value that a little bit more. But sticking with the wide receiver position, Brian Thomas Jr. was one of the best receivers last season. He racked up over 1,200 receiving yards and 10 touchdowns. The Jaguars obviously traded up and used their second overall pick in the draft on Travis Hunter, who will be utilized as a wide receiver in Jacksonville. I'm not going to say that Thomas isn't going to be one of the best fantasy wide receivers still, because I do believe he will. But how big of an impact could Hunter potentially have on Thomas' value?
So I think one of the big things, and I'm not saying you're doing this, Matthew, but I think the big thing that a lot of people see is that a good receiver comes into the picture and they immediately say, well, the receiver that was already on that team, now I have to knock him down a few pegs. And that's rarely the case. When we see a team like this make an investment, where not only did they draft Travis Hunter, but they aggressively traded up to get Travis Hunter, they're going to have big plans for them. That tells me that sure, we might see the target share, which would kind of be the slice of the pie for Brian Thomas, shrink a little bit. But the investments that they've made into the passing game tell me that the pie itself, the passing volume, is going to grow enough that even if the sliver of the pie gets a little bit smaller, because it's coming from a bigger pie, it shouldn't change all that much.
Yeah.
I don't know. I might just be hungry here right now with all these food analogies. I apologize. But you look at James Gladstone and Liam Cohen, the new brass that they have there in Jacksonville. It's pretty obvious that they want to make serious investments on the offensive side of the ball. They also brought in Bashal Tutin, a guy who can catch the ball out of the backfield and make big plays. So this is the first time that we've seen them take the right approach with Trevor Lawrence, I think. When they tried to revamp the offense a few years ago, they brought in these big, flashy free agents. But I think that home growing your wide receiver room, getting guys that you can draft and develop is just a better overall process. And now they have two blue chip prospects in Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter. So I'm still going to be looking at Brian Thomas Jr. as a top 10 wide receiver going into this year. It's going to be really tough to knock him down, even if the situations have changed a little bit. I think the biggest mover for me isn't Brian Thomas Jr. moving down. It's moving Trevor Lawrence up in my rankings because this is the first time in his career that he has had two young blue chip prospects to throw to.
Now, do you think Lawrence is 100% capable? We've seen him struggle in the past with some consistency issues. Are we sure he can play all 17 games and accurately find these two receivers?
No, I'm not positive,
Yeah.
but I think that this gives us the best opportunity to actually evaluate him because his career so far, it's been nonstop changing coaching staffs. You know, one year after another, he's trying to learn new systems and he's got new playmakers and he's trying to get on new pages with new receivers. That's a really tough situation for any quarterback to go into. And then once you combine that with the injuries that he's had to deal with throughout his career, it's been a tough battle for him so far. So I think that Jacksonville is doing the right thing right now by making strong investments in the offense. Now they can accurately evaluate him with good pieces around him and see if he takes that step forward. And if he doesn't, now they're set up for a very nice situation that if they do need to move off of Trevor Lawrence, whether they want to trade him or whether they want to draft somebody else a year or two down the road, then they could drop another quarterback into a much better system than Trevor Lawrence had the ability to play in when he was young.
And in your final mock draft with football guys right before the actual draft, you had Tyler Warren going to the Jets at 7. He ended up falling to the Colts at 14. And then the Bears took Loveland before they took Warren. Why did you have Warren above Loveland? And do you think Chicago may end up regretting passing up on Warren?
I've gone back and forth, and a part of
Mhm.
my job is to do post-draft dynasty rankings,
Yeah.
and I'm not kidding when I say I have flip-flopped Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland 20 times since
Mhm.
that, Thursday night because I don't know how to make clear of what's happening right here. I think when you look at what Tyler Warren did last year, he is a very complete or a very complete tight end. He can block, he can run routes. We saw him lining up as a H-back from time to time. We saw him catch a touchdown after lining up as a center. He can really do it all. The Colston Loveland pick surprised me a little bit. When I was going through my film evaluation, I saw some run blocking plays where he was playing with a lot of effort and doing what he was supposed to. And I saw some other blocking plays that left me scratching my head a little bit. And that's my fear. I think that Colson Loveland is the much better receiver than Tyler Warren. Tyler Warren, however, is a much better blocker. And I've seen a lot of scouts with kind of mixed reviews. Some people say that Colson Loveland is a good blocker. Some say that he still needs to develop that. And I tend to lean with the latter a little bit. And my fear with that, if you are this big bodied, physical, pass catching tight end, if there isn't the fear of also being a good blocker, you don't get that same mismatch opportunity. They'll just start putting a cornerback on you, and they're going to struggle to beat that. We see this with Mike Gesicki. We see this with Kyle Pitts. And that is my fear for the downside with Colston Loveland. But there's other things to look at as well. Colson Loveland broke out at 19 years old. It took Tyler Warren until he was 21 years old to match the production that
Yeah.
Colson Loveland had at 19. He's a much younger prospect. So you could argue that there's more meat on the bone and more opportunity to grow. I think the Bears did the right thing by swinging for the upside with Colson Loveland. But if they wanted a player that they could draft and immediately plug into the offense, I think Tyler Warren would have been a better fit.
Mhm. Now, we mentioned how one wide receiver comes in, it doesn't necessarily make a difference for the other wide receiver. Not quite like that for running backs. Obviously, the backfield is mainly one guy. And this was a really deep running back class. So I want to keep focusing on some running backs. Specifically Caleb Johnson, who went to the Steelers, and Amari Hampton, who went to the Chargers. How do you see these selections affecting Jalen Warren and Najee Harris this upcoming season? And, would you try to avoid those 2 guys now that there's more competition in the backfield?
It's really tough because we think we know all the answers, and this is, of course, the time of year right after the draft when we're so excited about all of these rookies, and we're
Mhm.
saying,
Yeah.
this day 7 or I'm sorry, this 7th round guy that went on day 3 is gonna overtake this veteran who's been there for 5 years. Rarely ever works out that way, so I'm trying to be as
Mhm.
objective as possible here. But
Yeah.
when I see Omari and Hampton, he is just such a better running back than Najee Harris. I mean, they do a lot of the same things where they have that burst in the short areas of the field. They can break contact or break tackles, great contact balance. The difference is Omari Hampton has the big play upside and the long speed that we don't see from Najee Harris. I
Mhm.
think something else to look at with Najee Harris is that he was signed in free agency. This is going to be his first year with the Chargers. He's not an incumbent running back that has been there for years. So when both of these guys come into camp, they're both going to be viewed on the same blank canvas. It's not like Hampton is showing up and Najee Harris already has a step up on him. So I think Hampton could come in there and just immediately be the better back and take the job. And we do see that from time to time. I don't think when they were looking at mock drafts, the Chargers expected that Omari Hampton was going to be there at 22. This was a guy who they were talking about possibly going in the top 10, top 15. So I think they signed Najee Harris hoping he'd be the answer. And then when Omari Hampton fell into the lap, they had no choice but to take him. If I had to bet on one of the two, I'd put my chips on Omari Hampton. He is a younger, bigger, faster running back, but he definitely fits the mold for what this Greg Roman, Jim Harbaugh offense likes. I was just looking this morning between Najee
Mhm.
Harris, Omari Hampton, Raheem Sanders, who they signed as an undrafted free agent, and Hassan Haskins, who's been on the roster for a couple of years. Every one of those running backs is over 6 foot and 220 pounds. So definitely the type that they like. Omarion Hampton fits there. As for Jalen Warren, I don't want to cop out, but I think that to look at what his usage is going to look like, we can just look back at the last 4 years. Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, I think it's going to be exactly the same. I think Caleb Johnson just gets dropped right into that Najee Harris role.
Yeah.
I think the fear is that the Steelers' offense might not be very good this year unless they're able to somehow land Aaron Rodgers. So if you're looking at Caleb Johnson just getting early down work on a less than stellar, low scoring Pittsburgh offense, that doesn't leave the best opportunity for fantasy. So I think this year I might lean towards Jalen Warren because he's got the pass catching chops, but I could totally be wrong. And Caleb Johnson might be able to develop that skill.
Mm. And throughout the first round of the draft, you were giving grades to each pick. And the lowest grade you gave was when the New York Giants traded up to draft Jackson Dart at 25. You gave that pick a C. Can you break down what makes you skeptical about that pick for New York? And would you have liked to see them target a different quarterback, not necessarily just Shador Sanders? I know you also had Milrow going at number 21 to the Steelers.
Yeah. And I gave it a C, and actually, after sleeping on it, I woke up the next day and I said I was probably a little bit too harsh on him. But if you see, that was the worst grade that I gave was a
Yeah.
C. I didn't think that there were any egregiously
Mhm.
terrible trades or
Yeah.
moves or anything in round one this year. I think every team did a pretty good job of staying disciplined, sticking to consensus big boards, and addressing needs. The Jackson Dart one, my immediate distaste was just um my review of Jackson Dart. I think that he's a bit
Mhm.
scattershot at times. I struggle with some of the decision making. As a big Trey Harris fan, watching through the Ole Miss tape last year, there were so many times where there would just be wide receivers wide open on an island, and Jackson Dart would still throw poorly. So my concerns with Jackson Dart have a lot to do with just the player more than anything else. But then after thinking about it a little bit longer, like I said, I felt like maybe I was a little bit too harsh on it. I think it was actually good process for the Giants because right now they don't have a long-term option at quarterback.
Yeah.
Jameis Winston, Russell Wilson, sure, you're looking at two fun, exciting bridge quarterbacks for this year, but there's no plan beyond that. And when you look at Brian Dable, he showed up there and he was kind of forced to take over Daniel Jones. And then they extended him when they couldn't trade up for Jaden Daniels. And then last year, just another mess of a quarterback situation. He finally gets his guy. And a lot of the concerns that I have about Jackson Dart were the same exact concerns I had about Josh Allen when he was drafted to Buffalo. And we saw what Brian Abel was able to do with that type of quarterback. Jackson Dart isn't as big and he isn't as
Mhm.
physical of a runner as Josh Allen, but I think that they did the right thing by letting Dable kind of make his choice at quarterback. And now he has the opportunity to develop him and hopefully keep his job for more than a couple of years.
Now, another draft pick that you graded low was Green Bay Packers selecting Matthew Golden at 23. You gave that a C plus, which again isn't really that low of a grade, but it was, I believe, your second lowest grade that you did give in round one. I know you're pretty high on Golden since you had him going to the Cowboys at 12 in your mock draft. So was this grade more due to Green Bay's fit and the fact that maybe they didn't need to prioritize wide receiver round one?
Yeah, and I think, when you look at Dallas, they had a desperate need at wide receiver that they just ignored in this
Yeah,
draft for whatever
mhm,
reason.
I did
I'm
see
not
that.
sure what. And the reason I liked Golden there is my comp for Golden was Brandon Cooks, who they just lost in free agency. You also look at Schottenheimer, he likes to run a
Yeah,
heavy play action offense that really needs to establish the run in order for that to work. I thought Golden would have been very well suited in that role, but I guess that they're content keeping Cavante Turpin, another deep threat in that role. Really what it comes down to, my grade pre-draft on Golden was a little bit lower than a lot of other people's. I saw that the majority of his production came when Isaiah Bond missed late in the year. We haven't seen Matthew Golden producing for years and years and years. It was just kind of this flash in the pan late in the season over a 4 game stretch. He followed that up with a big combine performance as well. But what I see when I look at Matthew Golden is a guy who never even climbed atop his own team step chart until the real wide receiver one went
yeah,
down. So that concerns me a little bit. I also look at some of the other needs for the Packers. I think there were bigger needs than wide receiver. Uh, they don't have a true wide receiver one right now. And I don't think that Matthew Golden is a true wide receiver one either. He's not the guy that's going to come in and be that Devontae Adams that they lost out on a few years ago. So you look at this receiver room right now with Jaden Reed and Romeo Dubs and Dontavian Wicks, Christian Watson, Matthew Golden, and then you also talk about the pass catching tight ends that they have and Tucker Kraft and Luke
Like
Musgrave.
Musgrave. Mhm.
It's very similar to the Bears, where there's kind of, I don't like throwing the term too many mouths to feed around, but one of these guys is going to be a talented pass catcher watching from the sidelines on most snaps. And I don't think Golden really addresses the issue that they had, which is trying to find that guy that could play that prototypical X role and be a primary pass catcher. Golden is just another guy who is going to rely on gimmicky usage to really hit his full potential.
And sticking with wide receiver, besides Travis Hunter, Ted McMillan was the first wide receiver to get taken. He went to the Carolina Panthers. He obviously has potential to be one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football this season. But does Carolina's ability to get red zone opportunities concern you at all? Because with my limited fantasy knowledge that I go in with every year, I just like to avoid players that obviously don't get a lot of red zone opportunities, even if they are a big workhorse and get a lot of targets or a lot of carries.
Well, that's not a bad mindset. If you just go after players on good teams, you're probably going to
Mhm.
be okay in fantasy, but that doesn't mean that there isn't gold to occasionally be found on bad teams as well.
Yes.
And I think that's what Ted McMillan is. And Ted McMillan was a guy I had done 3 mock drafts throughout February, March, and April. And I had Ted McMillan going to Carolina in every single one of those mock drafts. And I never wavered, even when his over under started to slip a little bit down drafts, because it just makes so much sense. This is exactly what the Dave Canales offense needs. When he was in Seattle, they had DK Metcalf playing that X receiver role. When he went to Tampa Bay, he had Mike Evans there, and that was the missing piece in Carolina. They were trying to force Xavier Legette into that role last year, but that's not what he's built for. So now that they have that prototypical big bodied, contested catch, field stretching X receiver, I think it also pushes everybody else into their more natural roles.
Mhm.
Xavier Legette, now he'll probably play out of the slot where he's got the athleticism to do so.
Yeah.
Adam Thielen might get some occasional slot snaps here. I'm not factoring him in too much because I don't think he's a part of the long term plans, but he'll get his snaps this year. But then Jalen Coker can move out to the flanker role where he does his best stretching fields vertically, pretty much all he did at Holy Cross. So not only do I like this move for Ted McMillan specifically, but I also like it for Leggett and Coker as I think it pushes them into their more natural roles. As for trying to find gold on bad teams, as I like to say, I think a lot of people see Bryce Young's rookie season and they see him getting benched in year two, and they just immediately assume that Bryce Young isn't a good quarterback.
Mhm.
But what we saw over the final month of the season
Yeah.
last year
Mhm.
was a completely different Bryce Young. When he
Mhm.
came back from that benching midseason, he immediately looked better, looked more confident, and he just improved every week. And over the final month of the season, you want to talk about fantasy football, he was tied with Baker Mayfield for the most fantasy points over the last 4 weeks. So I think it kind of clicked for him. And I think that they needed to bench him early on, not because he wasn't doing well, but I think that with a whole new installation and new players and a new offensive line, I think everybody on offense was overwhelmed a little bit. So by putting Bryce Young on the bench, bringing in a capable veteran like Andy Dalton, who has had no issue learning new systems throughout his career, it helped everything else fall into the place. The receivers learned their roles, the offensive line started to mesh, and once everything around him became a little bit more stable, then they were able to drop Bryce Young in where he was able to play much better football.
And besides the players that we've talked about already, I know this is a broad question, but do you have any general sleepers that you're really high on, specifically in fantasy football this upcoming season?
Uh, the term sleeper, I don't know how deep you want me to get here. This one might be a little bit obvious, but Trey Harris is a receiver that I was just
Mhm.
obsessed with. And I dropped
Yeah,
his name a little bit earlier when we were talking about Jackson Dart.
yeah.
But when I start my rookie scouting process, the first thing I do is look at the numbers. And Trey Harris last year had over 5 yards per route run. PFF has been tracking college advanced analytics since 2014. No receiver has ever had that many yards per route run. I mean, he is breaking spreadsheets out here with his production. He had over 1,000 yards receiving in just 8 games before his season ended with an injury. And I think there's a misconception about Trey Harris because his
Mhm.
role at Ole Miss was very limited. 91.7% of his routes were either verts or in breaking routes. That's pretty much all they asked him to do. So I think that people see that and they say, well, that's all he's able to do. But if you look a little bit closer and you watch the snaps where he lines up and he gets press coverage and he's forced to beat man coverage, he does it regularly and he does it with hesitation and nuance in his route running. So I think there's kind of two ways that things can break out for him now with the Los Angeles Chargers. The best case scenario is that he is this well-rounded receiver and we just never got to see it at Ole Miss, in which case he's an immediate, you know, primary or secondary option alongside Lad McConkey for Justin Herbert. And we love that for him. The worst case scenario still, I don't think, is that bad, where they can have Lad McConkey playing the X receiver like he did last year. Trey Harris can line up in the slot where he gets a little bit of distance from his defender, and they can ask him to run a lot of the same routes that he ran last year. That usage would be very similar to what we've seen from Amon St. Brown, his first year in the league, where he wasn't a fully developed receiver, but he was still able to consistently make plays. We saw it with Rashee Rice in Kansas City, not a fully developed receiver, but they did what he did well, and they got him the ball in those situations. I could see a similar developmental plan for Trey Harris, where this year he might just be running slants, screens, and verts, but if he's doing that well, while Lad McConkey is drawing the primary coverage, it could still be a good role in fantasy football.
And we've covered a lot of specific players at this point. I know it's really early to say this, but if you had to pick an overall draft winner now that the entire draft has wrapped up, who had the best team?
From yeah, I like the entire draft that the Seattle Seahawks did. I think they took a lot of flack for trading
Mhm.
away Geno Smith, but I saw the vision. They wanted to get younger and they wanted to go into a full rebuild, but they didn't really have to go into a full rebuild. This is kind of one of those soft rebuilds where they brought
Yeah.
in a veteran like Cooper Cup and they addressed every position of need that they had going into the draft. They got Gray Zabel in the first round, who immediately helps their front. Nick Emenwari was a faller that they were able to
Yeah.
capture in round two after one of the best combine performances we've ever seen. Elijah Arroyo is going to be able to work opposite Noah Fant in 12 personnel, which we know Clint Kubiak likes to run out a lot. And
Mhm.
then Jalen Milrow is a sneaky pick here. And like you mentioned earlier, I did have him mocked going in round one. I think the athletic traits there are so desirable. And I think a lot of people, like I said about Trey Harris, they have a misconception about Jalen Milrow as well. I think they think that he is this just athletic guy with a big arm who can run and he struggles to read defenses. I don't see that he struggles to read defenses. He often finds the open guy. His problem is that he doesn't have touch in the short game. He kind of has the Cam Newton quality of wanting to throw every ball at 100 miles an hour, even when he's got a wide open defender or receiver 10 feet in front of him. So I think that a little bit of coaching is all it's going to take for Jalen Milrow to step up. We have to remember this guy was a academic Heisman winner,
Mhm.
cum laude graduate after just 3 years, and then stayed in college so he can get his master's and keep playing football. He's a very, very smart guy. I think that he's going to have no question or no issues getting up to NFL speed. And you look, Sam Darnold is there on what looked like a really gaudy contract. Once we got the details of the contract, they do have an out after this season. I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but
Mhm.
I think about over a decade ago, Matthew, Matt Flynn had
Mm.
himself a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
end of season finish in Green
Mhm.
Bay. Seattle Seahawks gave him a ton of money. He was
Mhm.
presumed to be the week one starter. They spent a round three pick on Russ Wilson. And
Yeah.
what happened in camp that year? Russ Wilson beat out Matt Flynn and turned into the Russ Wilson that we know
Mhm.
today. That's not assuredly going to happen with Jalen Milrow, but it's definitely on the table for with the upside that he has. But then another pick that they came through with here, they were able to get Torrey Horton in round five. I had a round three grade on Torrey Horton, so the fact that he fell all the way to them, I think he's a guy that immediately has the skill set to work into three wide receiver sets. So there were so many picks that were just my guys that the Seattle Seahawks were going after this year, and I think they knocked the draft out of the park.
Yeah, and if you weren't gonna mention the, Russell Wilson thing, I did see your tweet, so I was gonna bring that up. I love that connection. And I do have one final question to ask before we wrap things up. If there was one piece of advice you could give to an aspiring broadcaster and journalist like me, what would it be?
I like that you asked me this question, Matthew. I did a show from 2020 to 2022 where I did
Mhm,
a lot of what you're doing right now, where I was interviewing people and I
mhm,
asked people this question all the time.
mhm,
And I'm going to copy the same answer that I got from so many people because it's true. You have to be authentic and you have to be genuine. I think there's so many people out here who see their favorite content creator or see their favorite person on TV and they say, I want to be the next whoever that person is that they idolize. But when you're trying to be somebody else, it comes off as inauthentic and it comes off as disingenuous. If you are just yourself, if you have a take, even if you know people are probably going to disagree with this take, if you believe it because you have your process and you genuinely can portray the way that you feel, that genuineness is impossible to replicate. So I know that's a really broad and generic answer, but really just be yourself because that ends up shining through in the content that you make.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I can't thank you enough for coming on. Is there anything else you want to say to the people watching before we wrap things up? Where can they find some of your work?
Yeah, everything's over at footballguys.com. You can find it all there pretty simply. But I just want to thank you, Matthew, again for taking the time to do this today. It's really awesome to see young people getting involved in creating content. And I see the connections you're out here making with other people in the industry. Consider myself a big fan of you, Matthew. I will continue supporting you and hope to see a bright future.
Yeah, I really, really do appreciate those kind words. Again, big thanks to Dave Kluge for being the 64th ever Highlight Haven interview guest. And as always, we will see you next time.